The lights inside St. Peter's Basilica went dark. 10,000 people held their breath. And Pope Leo XIV, standing alone at the altar, said 7 words that would send shockwaves across the entire world. The Vatican had been preparing for something, but no one, not the cardinals, not the press, not the diplomats watching from their embassies, expected what came next. It was the evening of July the 2nd, 2026. Rome was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. Inside the Apostolic Palace, a small group of advisors had gathered around Pope Leo XIV. The meeting was unscheduled. No agenda had been circulated, no topic had been announced. The men in that room only knew one thing. The Pope had summoned them personally. She and he looked like a man who had made a decision he could not take back. Robert Francis Provost, the first American, born Pope in history, had spent the last 11 months navigating one crisis after another. Wars in the Middle East, a brutal conflict in Iran that had already killed thousands of civilians, tensions with the most powerful government on earth, a government led by a man who had already attacked him publicly, a church still fractured by internal divisions, with conservative cardinals pushing back against every reform he attempted. He had barely finished his first Easter as Pope, his Urbi et Orbi message, delivered just 3 days earlier from the central loggia of St. Peter's, had been a direct call for peace, a call that some in Washington considered an insult. He had announced a prayer vigil. He had spoken of hope. But behind the public words, something deeper was stirring inside him, something he had been carrying since the early days of his papacy, a conviction that the Church needed to do more than pray. It needed to speak directly, unflinchingly, even if it meant war with the powerful. And now he was about to do something unprecedented. But before continuing with the story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive. That night, the Pope sat at the head of a long wooden table inside a room most people will never see. The walls were lined with centuries-old maps. The ceiling was frescoed. But no one in the room was looking at the art. They were all looking at him. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table, handwritten, or in his own handwriting. "I want to speak about darkness," he said. The room went silent. One of the cardinals, a senior figure from the Curia, leaned forward. "Holy Father, what kind of darkness?" Leo didn't blink. "The kind that's already here?" What happened in that room over the next 40 minutes would not be made public for 3 more days. But what leaked out, in fragments and whispers, through unnamed Vatican sources, was enough to set the Catholic world on fire. Pope Leo XIV had drafted a message about the ancient prophecy of the 3 days of darkness, one of the most controversial, feared, and debated concepts in all of Catholic tradition. For centuries, mystics had spoken of a time when impenetrable darkness would cover the earth, when evil would walk freely and only the faithful, who are behind closed doors with blessed candles, would survive. No sitting pope had ever addressed it directly, until now. But here's the part that stunned everyone. Leo was not endorsing the prophecy. He was not saying it was coming. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was reinterpreting it. And his interpretation pointed not to some distant supernatural event, but to something already unfolding right now, in real time. The whispers began that same night. A Vatican official, speaking on condition of anonymity, told a European news outlet that the Pope had used the phrase, "We are living through our own 3 days of darkness." The quote spread instantly. Within hours, it was trending in 14 countries. Catholic blogs posted it with alarming headlines. Most secular media picked it up and ran analysis pieces asking whether the Pope had lost his mind. Conspiracy forums erupted. Preachers who had been warning about the end times for years pointed at their screens and said, "We told you." And the Vatican had said nothing. No confirmation, no denial, no clarification, just silence. The kind of silence that feeds speculation, the kind that turns whispers into headlines and headlines into movements. That silence lasted until July 3rd. On that morning, the Pope appeared at his private chapel for early Mass. Only a handful of people were present. 2 priests, a nun who served as his personal secretary, and a Swiss guard standing at the door. According to one of those present, Leo prayed longer than usual. He knelt for almost 20 minutes after communion. When he stood, his face was composed, but his eyes were red. Something was weighing on him. Later that morning, he made a single phone call. The recipient was Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. The Élysée Palace later confirmed the call took place, but released only a brief statement saying both leaders discussed the necessity of dialogue and negotiations to resolve conflicts. What they did not say was that Leo had told Macron something specific, something about what he planned to say on July 5th at the peace vigil he had announced during his Easter message. Macron, according to a French diplomatic source, responded with one word: courageous. But what he found next changed everything. On the morning of July 4th, the Vatican press office released a short statement that Pope Leo XIV would preside over a prayer vigil for peace in St. Peter's Basilica on July 5th at 6 in the evening. The statement was routine. It matched what had already been announced on Easter Sunday, but buried in the final paragraph was a single sentence that no one had seen coming. The Holy Father will deliver a reflection on the spiritual darkness of our time and the call to remain vigilant. That sentence detonated. Catholic media exploded. Conservative commentators seized on the word darkness and began speculating wildly. Was the Pope about to validate the 3 days of darkness prophecy? Was he signaling the end times? Progressive voices pushed back immediately, calling it a metaphor. Theologians weighed in from every direction. Social media became a battlefield of interpretations. And through it all, the Vatican remained absolutely silent. Inside the walls, however, things were moving fast. The Pope's closest advisors were divided. Some believed he was making a historic mistake. Speaking about the 3 days of darkness, even metaphorically, risked legitimizing fringe movements, apocalyptic cults, and conspiracy theorists who had been waiting for exactly this kind of signal. Others argued the opposite. The world was burning. Wars raged. Artificial intelligence was advancing without moral guardrails. Millions were losing faith. The Pope had a duty to name the darkness and to offer light. Leo listened to both sides. Then he said something that ended the debate. If I cannot name what is happening, I am not a shepherd. I am a decoration. No one argued after that. The night of July 4th was long inside the Vatican. The Pope worked on his address until well past midnight. He wrote by hand the way he always did, a habit from his years as a seminary teacher in Peru, where computers were scarce and words had to be chosen with care. He crossed out lines. He rewrote entire paragraphs. He consulted Scripture, the book of Exodus, where God sent 3 days of darkness upon Egypt, the book of Revelation, where the fifth angel poured darkness upon the earth. He read passages from St. Augustine, the founder of his own religious order, who had written about the darkness of the soul with a precision that still cut through the centuries. At one point, according to a member of his household staff, he stood at the window of his study and stared at the dome of St. Peter's for nearly 10 minutes without moving. The dome was lit from below, and as it always was at night, a beacon visible from every hill in Rome. But on this night, it seemed to mean something different. It seemed like a question. When he finally went to bed, he left the speech on his desk, unfinished. The final section, the one that would contain the line heard around the world, had not yet been written. He would write it in the morning. Or perhaps he already knew what he was going to say and simply could not bring himself to put it on paper. Not yet. And what happened inside that room was never meant to be revealed. The next day, July 5th, Rome woke up to gray skies. There was a tension in the air that went beyond weather. Thousands of people had already begun gathering in St. Peter's Square by early afternoon. Pilgrims from Poland carrying handmade banners, families from the Philippines who had traveled for days to be there, students from African seminaries, clutching prayer books, elderly women with rosaries wrapped around their wrists, young men holding candles they had brought from home, some of them beeswax candles, a direct reference to the prophecy they had read about online. Street vendors outside the square were selling blessed candles at triple the normal price. Italian police confiscated dozens of apocalyptic pamphlets being distributed near the colonnade. The atmosphere was electric, part pilgrimage, part protest, part something no one could quite name. The square filled slowly, then, all at once. By 4 in the afternoon, the Vatican Gendarmerie estimated 8,000 people. By 5 o'clock, it was 12,000. By 5:30, an estimated 15,000 people stood in the square, with thousands more filing into the basilica through the security checkpoints. Television cameras from 32 countries were trained on the entrance. News helicopters circled above. The Italian police had tripled their security presence. A bomb-sniffing unit had swept the basilica twice. Everyone felt it. Something was about to happen, something that could not be undone. At exactly 6 tar, the bells of St. Peter's rang. Pope Leo XIV entered the basilica through the main doors. He walked slowly, deliberately, wearing simple white vestments, no crown, no elaborate procession, just a man walking toward the altar of the largest church in Christendom. The silence was absolute. He reached the altar and turned to face the congregation. For a long moment he simply looked at them, scanning the faces, the old, the young, the scared, the hopeful. Then he spoke. "Brothers and sisters, we gather tonight not because we are afraid. We gather because we refuse to be blind." His voice was calm, measured, but there was something underneath it, a gravity that made people lean forward. He began by addressing the wars, the conflict in Iran, the ongoing violence in the Holy Land, the displacement of millions. He spoke of the children who had lost parents, the parents who had lost children. He described the destruction of civilian homes and hospitals as what it was, a crime against humanity. War divides, he said. Hope unites. Arrogance tramples. Love lifts. Then he shifted, and this is where the world stopped breathing. There is an ancient tradition, he continued, spoken of by mystics and saints across centuries, a tradition that speaks of 3 days of darkness, 3 days when the light of the world would be extinguished, 3 days when evil would walk unchallenged. From blessed Anna Maria Taigi in the 19th century to whispered warnings passed between grandmothers and grandchildren, this prophecy has haunted the Catholic imagination for generations. The basilica was so quiet you could hear the candles flickering, thousands of tiny flames trembling in unison. Many have debated whether this prophecy is literal, whether it speaks of a future event, whether it is a warning from heaven or a symbol born of human fear. He paused, looked down at his notes, then looked back up and pushed them aside. The prepared text slid across the marble lectern. He would speak from the heart now. I am not here to validate prophecy. I am not here to predict the future. I'm here to name the present. And then something unexpected happened. He raised his hand and gestured to the basilica around him. Look at this world. Look at what we have allowed. Nations dropping bombs on hospitals while diplomats shake hands at summits. Technology that can think but cannot love. Artificial intelligence that can compose symphonies and write poetry but cannot feel the weight of a single tear. Leaders who speak of God while ordering the destruction of entire neighborhoods. Children raised by screens instead of parents, growing up in a world that has more information than ever and less wisdom than ever before. Loneliness spreading like a plague in the richest countries on earth, countries where people have everything except each other. His voice rose, not to a shout, but to something harder, something that cut through the marble and the gold and the centuries of ceremony. We have built machines that can see in the dark, but we ourselves are blind. We have weapons that can strike from the sky without warning, but we cannot find the courage to sit across a table and talk. We have conquered the atom, and yet we cannot conquer our own hatred. He let that sink in. If this is not darkness, then what is? The crowd stirred. Some were crying, others were frozen. We do not need to wait for 3 days of darkness, Leo. We are living through them, and not because God has abandoned us, but because we have abandoned each other. He let that sentence hang in the air. The mystics spoke of blessed candles, the only light that would survive. I tell you tonight, the blessed candle is not made of wax. It is made of faith, of mercy, of the refusal to hate, even when hatred is easier. He stepped forward, closer to the congregation, closer than popes usually get. This church will not hide behind prophecy. This church will not use fear as a weapon. We will walk into the darkness, not with candles made of wax, but with the fire of the gospel, and we will bring light. The applause that erupted was not the polite kind. It was the kind that comes from the gut. People stood, people wept. In the square outside, the sound carried through the speakers and 15,000 more people joined in. But Leo was not finished. He raised his hand again. The applause died. And then he delivered the line that would be quoted on every news broadcast, every front page, every social media platform on the planet within the hour. The real 3 days of darkness are not coming. They are here. And the only question that matters is this: will you be the candle, or will you close your eyes? The silence that followed was deafening. In Washington, the speech was watched in real time at the State Department. Senior analysts had been briefed to monitor the vigil after the leaked quotes from July 2nd. Sources later confirmed that officials were caught off guard by the directness of the Pope's words, not just the darkness metaphor, but the specific references to civilian infrastructure, to technology without conscience, and to leaders who invoke God while ordering destruction. Everyone in the room understood who he was talking about. Within hours, the White House released a statement accusing the Vatican of politicizing faith and inserting itself into affairs it does not understand. President Trump posted on Truth Social that the Pope was suffering from what he called a delusion of omnipotence. Ironically, the very same phrase Leo himself had used days earlier to describe the forces driving war. Trump added, maybe the Pope should focus on his empty churches instead of lecturing the greatest country in the world. The irony was not lost on anyone, neither was the danger. A sitting Pope and a sitting president locked in a public confrontation, not over doctrine, not over theology, over the very nature of darkness and light. In Paris, Isabelle Macron issued a brief statement calling the speech a moral landmark for our century. In London, the Archbishop of Canterbury said it was the most important papal address in a generation. In Buenos Aires, crowds gathered outside the Metropolitan Cathedral and played the speech on loudspeakers until midnight. In Manila, a bishop wept on live television while reading Leo's words aloud to his congregation. But the reaction that mattered most came from inside the Vatican itself. On the morning of July the 6th, the day after the vigil, Pope Leo summoned the senior cardinals of the Curia to a meeting in the Sala Bologna. According to multiple sources, the atmosphere was tense. Several conservative cardinals were furious. They believed Leo had gone too far. They, by referencing the 3 days of darkness, even to reinterpret it, he had opened a door that could not be closed. The fringe would claim victory. The faithful would be confused. The Church's enemies would use it to mock them. One cardinal reportedly slammed his palm on the table and said this was exactly the kind of recklessness that had worried them since the day of his election. Another raised a different concern. The Pope's confrontation with Washington was escalating. Trump's response had been immediate and vicious. American Catholic donors, some of the wealthiest in the world, were already threatening to redirect their funding away from Vatican initiatives. Prominent Catholic university in the United States had released a statement distancing itself from the Pope's remarks. The political cost was real, and it was growing by the hour. Cardinal Gerhard Müller, one of the most prominent conservative voices in the Church, reportedly told the Pope directly that the speech had been reckless and unnecessary. Leo listened patiently. He let every man finish. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. And when the last cardinal had spoken, he waited 3 full seconds before responding. The silence was excruciating. Leo's response was quiet, almost gentle. "Tell me, Cardinal, when the house is on fire, do you debate the color of the curtains?" No one spoke. "I understand your concerns," he continued, his voice low but steady. "I understand the political consequences. I understand the financial implications. But I did not take this chair to manage a corporation. I took it to serve the gospel, and the gospel does not care about donor lists." He stood up slowly and looked at each man in the room. "I did not come to this chair to preserve comfort. I came to tell the truth. And the truth is this: we are failing, not because God has failed us, because we have failed to act. The darkness I spoke of is not prophecy. It is a diagnosis. And if we do not treat it, it will consume everything we claim to love." The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, no official statement was released. But one cardinal, who asked not to be identified, told a journalist something remarkable. "He is not afraid. That is what terrifies some of us. A pope who is not afraid changes everything." By the afternoon of July 6th, the full text of the Peace Vigil address had been translated into 27 languages and posted on the Vatican website. It became the most downloaded papal document since Francis's Laudato Si. Within 48 hours, the phrase, "Will you be the candle?" had been shared over 6 million times across social media platforms. Pope Leo XIV had done what no pope before him had dared. He had taken one of the most feared prophecies in Catholic history and turned it into a mirror. He had forced the world to look at its own darkness, not as something coming, but as something already here, not as punishment from God, but as a consequence of human choices. And he had done it without raising his voice, without dramatic gestures, without supernatural claims, just a man at an altar telling the truth. On the morning of July 7th, Leo boarded the papal plane for Algeria, the first stop on his longest international trip yet. As reporters gathered in the cabin for the customary in-flight press conference, one journalist asked if he had any regrets about the vigil speech. Leo smiled, a rare sight. "Regrets? No, I said what needed to be said. The world is dark, but darkness has never won. Not once, not ever." He paused, then added, "I'm not afraid of the darkness, and I am not afraid of those who profit from it." When asked if that was a reference to any particular government or leader, he simply said, "I speak about the gospel. I am not a politician." The plane took off. Below, Rome grew smaller. The dome of St. Peter's caught the morning light, a single bright point against a troubled sky. Patti was heading to the land of St. Augustine, the saint whose order had shaped his entire life. A man who had written about darkness and light 16 centuries ago. A man who understood that the greatest battles are not fought with armies, but with ideas. Somewhere in that city, the candles from the vigil were still burning. In homes and chapels across Rome, people had kept them lit. Not because they believed in the literal prophecy, but because they had heard something in the Pope's words that resonated deeper than fear. They had heard a man willing to stand in the darkness and refuse to close his eyes. The story of what Pope Leo XIV said on July 5th is not over. It is, perhaps, just beginning. The darkness he named has not lifted. The wars continue. The divisions deepen. The technology advances without a conscience. And governments grow more aggressive. Trust between nations erodes. And inside the church itself, the fault lines grow wider with every passing week. But something shifted that night in St. Peter's. Something that cannot be unseen. Something that cannot be unheard. A pope stood before the world and said the quiet part out loud. He took a prophecy that had been whispered in fear for 200 years and turned it into a call to action. He did not promise miracles. He did not offer easy answers. He did not tell people to stock up on blessed candles and lock their doors. He offered something harder and infinitely more valuable. He offered the truth. And in a world drowning in darkness, truth is the only light that lasts. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss what happens next. And leave a comment below. Do you believe we are living through our own 3 days of darkness? Your voice matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.